The train whistle screamed through the canyon walls as it rolled into the small depot at Cedar Bend, spitting steam and cinders into the dry afternoon air, and Margaret Foley pressed her gloved hand against the window glass, watching the town rise up out of the dust like something conjured from a dream she had not dared to have. She was 22 years old, a schoolteacher from Boston with a satchel full of borrowed books and a single trunk containing everything she owned, and she had crossed half a continent on the promise of a teaching position that a distant cousin had arranged for her in this rough, sun-scorched territory. She had told herself, over and over during the long days of travel, that she was not running from anything, that this was simply an opportunity too good to refuse. Though in the quiet hours before dawn, staring at the ceiling of whatever boarding house had taken her in for the night, she knew the truth was more complicated than that. She had left behind a broken engagement, a mother who wept at the thought of her daughter traveling alone into the wilderness, and a life that had begun to feel like a room with the walls slowly closing in. When the train finally shuddered to a stop and the conductor called out the name of the town, Margaret gathered her satchel and her courage in equal measure and stepped down onto the platform, uncertain of what waited for her beyond the wooden depot doors. She did not expect, in that first uncertain moment, to be nearly run down by a man moving with the kind of urgency that suggested either great trouble or great foolishness, and it took her a moment to realize he had stopped himself just short of colliding with her, his boots skidding in the dust as he threw out a hand to steady them both. He was tall, sun-browned, dressed in the rough leather and denim of a working cattleman, his vest hanging open over a shirt gone gray with dust and sweat, a wide-brimmed hat shading eyes that, when they finally settled on her face, seemed to lose whatever urgency had propelled him across the platform in the first place. His name, she would soon learn, was Jesse Calloway, foreman of the Calloway ranch some 10 miles outside of town, and he had come to the depot that day not to meet a passenger but to intercept a shipment of cattle vaccine that the railroad had, through some clerical error, nearly sent on to the wrong station entirely. He apologized at once for his carelessness, though his eyes lingered on her a beat longer than courtesy required, and Margaret, unused to the directness of Western men, found herself flustered in a way she could not quite name. Their paths, however, were not finished crossing that day. The teaching position Margaret had traveled so far to claim, she soon discovered upon inquiring at the town's small mercantile, no longer existed, the previous arrangement having fallen through when the schoolhouse itself burned in a grass fire 2 months prior. A fact her cousin's letter, delayed by the unreliable mail routes of the territory, had never managed to convey. She stood on the boardwalk outside the mercantile with her single trunk and her borrowed books, feeling the full weight of her situation settle over her like a physical thing. 3,000 miles from home with no position, no prospects, and precious little money to see her through until she could arrange passage back east, a journey she was not at all certain she wished to make, given what waited for her there. It was Jesse Calloway, passing by with the vaccine crates loaded onto his wagon, who noticed her standing there with an expression he recognized from his own hardest days, and though it was no business of his, he found himself climbing down from the wagon seat and asking if she needed help. She resisted at first, some stubborn pride refusing to admit to a stranger how thoroughly her plans had collapsed, but Jesse had a patient, unhurried way of asking questions that made a person feel it was safe to answer honestly, and within a quarter hour Margaret had told him everything: the burned schoolhouse, the empty position, the uncertain road ahead. He listened without offering false comfort or empty promises, and when she finished, he simply said that Cedar Bend was a town that needed a teacher whether or not the old schoolhouse still stood, and that if she was willing to make do with a borrowed room in the church hall for a season, he suspected the town council would find the money to pay her, given how many ranch families around these parts had children growing up without their letters. It was not the offer of a man trying to win her favor, she would come to understand later, but simply the plain practicality of someone who had spent his whole life solving problems as they arose, and there was something in his straightforward kindness that unsettled her more deeply than any practiced charm ever could have. The town council, when Jesse brought the matter before them that very evening, agreed readily enough, relieved to have the problem of their children's education solved without the trouble of riding east for another candidate. And within a week Margaret found herself standing before a room full of restless, sunburned children in the borrowed hall of the Cedar Bend Church, chalk in hand, feeling for the first time since her arrival that she had found solid ground beneath her feet. Jesse's youngest sister, Ruth, was among her pupils, a sharp-eyed girl of 11 who took an immediate and vocal liking to her new teacher, and it was through Ruth's constant chatter about her brother that Margaret found herself learning far more about Jesse Calloway than she had any right to know. How he had taken over the running of the family ranch at 19 when their father's heart gave out. How he had held the place together through 2 bad drought years and a cattle fever that had nearly ruined half the ranchers in the county. How he had never once, in all the years since, taken a single day for himself. Margaret told herself, in the weeks that followed, that her growing awareness of Jesse Calloway's comings and goings around town was simply the natural curiosity of a newcomer settling into a small community. But she could not quite explain the particular lift in her chest whenever his wagon rolled past the schoolhouse, or the care she began to take with her appearance on the days she knew business might bring him into town. Jesse, for his part, found reasons of his own to pass by more often than the ranch's needs strictly required, and it became a quiet, unspoken thing between them. These small accumulating moments, a shared laugh over Ruth's latest mischief, a conversation about books that stretched far longer than either of them intended, a walk along the creek that ran behind the church where they said very little and yet somehow said everything. Neither of them spoke aloud of what was growing between them, for Margaret carried still the bruise of her broken engagement and the fear of trusting her heart too quickly again, while Jesse, for all his steadiness in matters of cattle and ranch business, found himself entirely without words when it came to matters of the heart, having buried himself so long in duty that he had nearly forgotten how to want something purely for himself. It was the arrival of a second train, some 3 months after Margaret's own, that finally forced the truth of things into the open. A telegram had reached her from Boston, from the very man whose broken promises had sent her fleeing west in the first place, informing her that he had reconsidered, that he wished to make amends, that he would be arriving on the noon train to escort her home and set right what had gone wrong between them. Margaret read the telegram 3 times before she could make sense of it, and found, to her own surprise, that the prospect filled her not with hope but with a hollow, sinking dread, for the life he was offering her, the comfortable house, the respectable society, the predictable days, had once seemed like everything she wanted, and now seemed like nothing at all compared to the small, dusty, difficult life she had built for herself in Cedar Bend. She did not tell Jesse of the telegram, uncertain of what right she had to burden him with a decision that was hers alone to make. And so it was that on the morning the Eastern train was due to arrive, Jesse Calloway found himself hearing the news secondhand from the station master, who mentioned in passing that the schoolteacher had a gentleman coming to fetch her home. Something in Jesse broke loose at those words, some dam of caution and duty he had built around his own feelings for longer than he cared to admit, and he left the ranch hands to finish the branding without him, riding hard for town with a recklessness that startled even his own horse. He reached the depot just as the Eastern train's whistle sounded in the distance, still a mile off but closing fast, and he found Margaret standing on the platform in her good blue dress, her trunk packed once more, her face pale and drawn in a way that told him this was no joyful reunion she was preparing for. He did not have a speech prepared, had never in his life needed words for the things that mattered on the ranch, where actions spoke plainly enough. But standing there with the train's smoke already visible against the sky, he found himself speaking anyway, telling her plainly that he did not have much to offer beyond a hard life and a struggling ranch and a heart that had been entirely too slow to recognize what was standing right in front of him, but that if she would give him the chance, he would spend every day proving himself worthy of her staying. He asked her, with the train's whistle growing louder behind them, to give him a chance, not out of pity or convenience, but because he loved her, plainly and completely, in a way he had never expected to love anyone. Margaret felt the whole weight of her carefully guarded heart give way at once, and she did not wait for the train to fully arrive before she answered him, closing the distance between them and taking his hand the way she had that very first day on the platform, though everything about the moment felt entirely different now. When the Eastern train finally pulled in and the man from Boston stepped down onto the platform, straightening his fine coat and searching the crowd for the woman he had come to reclaim, he found instead Margaret Foley standing hand in hand with a sun-browned rancher, her decision already written plainly across her face before she ever spoke a word. She thanked him, with more grace than he perhaps deserved, for making the long journey, but told him gently and firmly that her life had taken root elsewhere, in soil he had never thought to value, and that she would not be returning east with him. He left on the same train an hour later, his pride wounded but his conscience, perhaps, a little lighter for having tried. The wedding took place that autumn beneath the very cottonwood trees that lined the creek where Jessie and Margaret had spent so many quiet evenings talking of everything and nothing, with Ruth serving as the delighted flower girl and half the town turning out to celebrate a match that had, by then, surprised no one but the two people involved. Margaret continued teaching in the rebuilt schoolhouse, her classroom now filled with the children of neighbors who had become something closer to family, while Jessie expanded the ranch steadily over the following years, no longer carrying the weight of it entirely alone. They spoke often, in later years, of that first collision on the depot platform, laughing at how nearly they had missed each other entirely, and whenever a new train rolled into Cedar Bend carrying some other uncertain traveler with a trunk full of borrowed dreams, Margaret would think of the day her own train had been stopped, not by circumstance but by a man brave enough to ask for a chance. And she never once regretted the answer she had given him.